Welcome, everyone. I know people are still joining the webinar, but we wanted to go ahead and get started. Hopefully everybody is able to hear me now and is able to, in a moment, hear our wonderful guest, Pamela VanderPloeg, to talk about the restoration boom in Grand Rapids and West Michigan in the 1980s. And so we're really happy here to welcome you to this. My name is Nora Salas, and I'm the director of the Cucci Office of Local History. The Cucci Office of Local History was founded to give voice to diverse communities through history. We do this work through a variety of projects and programs. One of these is the Grand Rapids Time Traveler series that you're joining us with for today. With this series, we've been sort of moving through the decades, and today we're very fortunate to welcome our presenter, Pamela VanderPloeg. Pamela is an expert on the architectural history of Grand Rapids and West Michigan, and she's also the administrator and curator of a website, architecturegrandrapids.org, where she shares photographs and original research about the city's buildings and its urban landscape. As part of this work, Pamela creates tour guides, which are available to the public, featuring hundreds of historic, modern, and contemporary buildings. And she also shares her work and research through other avenues as well. And today she's going to be talking with us and I think sharing a lot of interesting images about the effects of preservation work on the built environment in Grand Rapids. One last note before we begin that I wanted to tell everybody about is that we are going to have a question and answer period after the presentation, and you can use the question and answer feature here in the webinar. It should be labeled Q&A near the bottom of your screen to type in questions that you would like to see addressed. Please note that we might not be able to get to all audience questions, and that this webinar is being recorded and will be available online soon through our YouTube channel. So thank you again for coming today, and I'm going to turn this over now to our guest, Pamela VanderPloeg.
I'm very happy to join you and to talk about the 1980s in Grand Rapids. Can you verify that you can hear me right now?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, good. I've done a few Zoom classes, but I'm no expert. So on this, I hope that I can really inform you and share a lot of fun facts about the 1980s in Grand Rapids. And I'm going to introduce the whole concept with three slides that are just pure text, just to give you some background. Here on the intro slide, you just see some examples of the buildings I'm going to talk about today. We've got the Pantland, the Carl Aldrich Building, of course, the Grand Rapids Police Department now, the Civic the Civic Auditorium facade, the Park Century Building, and the Leadyard, most of which would be quite familiar to all of you. In the 1980s, momentum was growing for reinvesting in the city's historic downtown. There was a new recognition that these grand old buildings, many of whom were empty and deteriorating, could be viable for use as offices, civic buildings, residential, commercial space, quite a variety of uses. And although there were many of those buildings that had a storefront, a viable storefront operating on the ground level, most of the upper floors in these buildings were vacant at the time. Renovation efforts included exterior repairs, structural improvements, all very necessary, interior modernization, that was crucial for advertising them for current use, for modern use, and retaining, saving, refabricating, in some cases, original elements. Sometimes it meant just leaving a historic element as it was. To give the downtown area new life, it sometimes takes just one building to get this process going. And the buildings that I'm going to show you are examples of those buildings that they were pioneers in the revitalization reinvestment process. Visionary city leaders for years, I would say since the 1940s, really, and really into the 50s, it heated up. But visionary city leaders had been seeking the right combination. And I want to stress the right combination of historic buildings and new construction, because it wasn't just that they wanted to bring back the historic buildings, but they also wanted to add some new things to the city downtown environment to draw city residents and especially visitors, conventions back downtown. So in this presentation, I just want to say that I do use several newspaper clippings from the Grand Rapids Press. Most of the slides are my own photos, but I do use some newspaper clippings. So here's just a quick chronology. Post-World War II was really characterized by a flight to the suburbs, as you all know. Not only, what was kind of interesting with that is, the suburbs just began developing. Builders, architects, all home basically from World War II. Many of them soldiers from World War II that went back to college on the GI Bill. They came back and they started building. And what is kind of interesting is not only did they build in the suburbs, but then Grand Rapids was losing population to the suburbs. The suburbs were burgeoning. So they began to actually annex the suburbs in the 60s. That was a huge period of growth for the city. But back to my timeline. 1955 to 1970 was urban renewal, basically, where there was money available for the city to do demolition and then also to add new buildings. And those new buildings started going up in the 1960s. Now, urban renewal is very controversial because we lost a lot of gems, but we also did gain some modern office towers as well that are considered emblematic of Grand Rapids now. In 1968, we had the founding of the Heritage Hill Association, and that really was part of the 1969 demolition of the old City Hall, because that just galvanized people about historic preservation. And that also was the start of the inauguration of the Kent County Historic Preservation Commission, and that made a big difference as well. In 1969, the City County Administration Building and Calder La Grande Vitesse were now on the VanderPloeg Plaza. And that was a big event. And really began to change. Those new buildings began to change not only the way downtown looked, but the way it drew people to it. 1971, the Heritage Hill was placed on the National Register. 1973, the City Commission's adoption of a local historic preservation ordinance happened. That was huge because until they did that, it didn't matter if there was a historic district or an interest in historic preservation. Without a local preservation ordinance, really nothing tangible could be done. In 1979, we had the Calder painting on the roof, not on the roof, but on the roof. And then in 1981, the last new building in the traditional urban renewal district is completed. And that's basically where we start our story in 1979, 1980. One more thing I want to tell you that was important. In the 70s, late 70s, the city of Grand Rapids started to award, or the mid 70s, I should say, award the designation City Historic Landmark to historic sites based on architectural integrity or the sites association with an event or person important in the city's history. This could be buildings, parks, cemeteries, bridges, roads, more. And they were nominated by the city or the public or a building owner. If a building owner didn't want it, it usually didn't happen. In 1973, those city historic landmark designations were awarded for the first time to the Heritage Hill Historic District, St. Cecilia Music Hall, and the Abram W. Pike House, all included in, well, not St. Cecilia, Abraham Pike is included in this story. When I say all included in this guide, that's a little transference of something from a book I've just completed on downtown buildings. So also to the Norton Indian Mounds District and the Eliphalet Turner House. So that's how that all got started. So here, this is important for you to see because this begins this 1980s process. This map is an urban renewal map that was printed in the Grand Rapids Press. And the red arrow shows how they changed the streets. That was really important to get the VanderPloeg Plaza area, which basically is between Monroe and Ottawa and Michigan and Lyon. So the urban renewal district, those green ovals there, those are the streets that were closed, Bond and Crescent, between Ottawa, Monroe, Michigan, and Lyon. And that enabled them to create that big plaza where the Calder is, because that's really basically two streets turned into one. So now the yellow arrow, that is part of what began to happen in the 80s. And let's move along onto that. Oh, before I move along, let me just say that where that yellow arrow points to is interesting. Not everyone knows this, but that is the area where DeVos Place is today. But it was at this time in the late 1970s, it was still a bunch of old buildings. It was old factories. The Bissell factory was down there, the Latilt Iron Works. These were all in that area between the river and Monroe. And the purpose, of course, was because businesses and manufacturing was always located on the river in the old days. They didn't see the riverbank as a development area for the city in terms of what we see it today for entertainment and more convention and that kind of thing. But back then, they had a problem because it was just a mass of old structures. Here is the last building of the Urban Renewal District, the Calder Plaza building, 1981. And this is how it has looked since 2017, when they most recently renovated and put that corner glass piece on that wasn't with it originally. What is kind of interesting and telling about this building is that in 1981, when it opened, it was one of the first condo style office buildings in Grand Rapids. And one of the firms that was in it was my husband's law firm, Smith Hoey Rice and Rogie. And the reason I share that is that 30 years later, they moved to this building on the Monroe Center, in the way that so many businesses have transferred their operations and their offices to the old restored historic buildings, because they have so much cachet these days with the momentum of downtown vibrancy and renewal. So this is one of the first things that happened in the 80s, one of the most interesting and of course no longer evident on the Monroe Center area, but this was when they closed Monroe to traffic and made it a pedestrian mall. There had been many architects and many city planners who had talked about doing it and thought it was just the best thing to do. So they did it. And where I put the star and the red arrow, that's basically where the Grand Rapids Art Museum is today. You can see that bank in the, just under the red arrow, red line, that actually was a very iconic bank. And now that facade is in Gaslight Village, East Grand Rapids. So this made a huge change. And since cars could no longer drive down this section of Monroe, there was the amphitheater and concerts, and maybe some of you might be old enough to remember the Blues on the Mall. That was a huge thing. We used to come down there all the time for that. So that's what it looked like then. Oh, and both of my daughter and my son worked here in the summers for the Parks Department, helping keep the mall clean and all of that. So, anyways, this was a very new and important thing. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful. But back up a year, and right there on the Monroe Mall, there's the Carl Aldrich building. I said that sometimes it takes a pioneer to make the changes happen. And Dr. Robert Carl Jr., you see, before 1979 or so, this building was just the Aldrich building. Well, in 1978, Dr. Robert Carl bought this building. His father, Robert Carl Jr., Dr. Robert Carl, his father, started his dental practice in this building on the second floor in 1938. So his son had really been coming down here all his life. And when he opened up his own practice with his father, in partnership with his father, he bought the building. And not only did he restore those second floor offices and update them for his practice, but he took the third floor and he turned it into a beautiful apartment. That was news in Grand Rapids. here, this is a wonderful article in the press about him turning that upstairs into his apartment. His quote from earlier articles was one day this building will be completely refurbished. It will be beautiful, a 1,400 square foot 2-bedroom apartment with an open plan living room, kitchen, and dining room. And he actually had a stairway that went up to the deck, and he grew roses on the top deck. So this is after he had finished his apartment and had his floor to ceiling windows to look out on the Monroe Center. He said it's not for everyone, but he loved it, and he had a dog he walked on the lawn. Here's another pioneer, was Gretchen Minhar. She is was an internationally known artist, and I would refer to her as a starchitect. And what I mean by that is she became very well known in the architectural profession. She was one of the early women to make her mark on architecture. She worked in the Marvin de Winter Associates office, and she had this vision. Her vision was that because there were so many of these buildings on Monroe, on what we know today as Monroe Center, there were so many of them vacant, and they could be offices, they could be residential, and they could be affordable. That was her goal. So she bought this building, the Fletcher Building, which you see on the left. And she turned it into a moderately priced downtown office. Now, it wasn't easy because when she had the building appraised, the appraisal came in lower than the renovation costs of $500,000. So, and one other anecdote, when she went to the bank to get her loan, the bank would not loan her the money without her husband coming in and co-signing on the loan. He was not happy. She was not happy. She was a successful architect in her own right, and yet things were so old style, I guess you'd say, that there was not a recognition of her ability to get that loan on her own. Well, at any rate, they worked that out, and she also had some economic loans, development loans from the city. And she made this beautiful building. She called it the Minhar Building, put her office on the top floor. And in 2019, after she died in 2018 of cancer, the building was rededicated, the Minhar Building. In 2005, someone who has a loft apartment, either in the Minhar Building or next door, I'm not totally clear on that, but found a painting on the interior brick that was just a stunning painted figure of a woman, real stylishly dressed. It was an old, like full length, just huge advertisement. And they do think it was part actually of an exterior wall, the 1907 brick wall that predated this building, because she did have turn of the century clothing on. So anyways, kind of just a little sidelight. So that this building was a groundbreaker, as was the Carl Aldrich Building. Also, when the Monroe Mall closed, or when Monroe closed to make the Monroe Mall, then at the end of the block at Fulton, the old Herpolsheimers became the city center. Now, the Herpolsheimers building, when it was built in 1949, was just a stunning building, and you can still see that in the building. It's been changed somewhat, but those huge 3-story windows, there was for many years a enormous American flag in those windows. They had lots of windows on the ground floor for displays, but it had really seen its time, and there was this plan to turn that building into the city center, and that was a group of stores and an indoor mall, basically. Herpolsheimers was given the 3rd floor. Now, that again was done by Marvin de Winter Associates, of which Gretchen Minhar was an associate, but Marvin de Winter was really the head of that firm, and they redesigned that building for the city center. Now, that wasn't successful either, honestly, but this is what the Herpolsheimers building looked like before they made the Civic City Center indoor mall, just so you have a good sense. And here's what it looked like after they changed it. It still had the monorail in the basement that kids loved at Christmas, but it has this more mall-ish look inside. And it had Gantos. Gantos was a prime shop. The Gantos shop was a prime mover in the whole city center project. Well, just very much about across the street from Herpelsheimer's was the Monument Square building. This is what it looks like today. But I bring this building up because I want to share some of the, I guess you'd say, some of the setbacks in the 80s. So 1980, we had the Pedestrian Mall, we had the City Center Mall, we had pioneers putting residential condos upstairs in these buildings in the upper floors, but the Monument Square building, which was just a wonderful, just a beautiful building, and really heralded at the time it was built in the early 1900s as a groundbreaker. The Grand Rapids Press just raved about this building when it went up. And actually, just for your interest, actually, in this building, when it first, in the early 1900s, the Grand Rapids Art Museum had their exhibit. It was called the Grand Rapids Art Association at the time. They had their exhibit space in this building until they moved into the Abram Pike House, which we'll get to in a minute. But anyways, what happened to this building, though, by the late 70s, it wasn't quite as grand, but it had a huge fire, 1980s, an arson fire. And this is what it looked like while they were trying to put out this fire. There were people actually, from what I've read, it sounds like there were people actually with residential units in this building, in the upstairs, and also many storefronts, of course. And this building was designed for storefronts on 2 levels. Well, by the time they put out the fire, all of those buildings had to move. The building was still standing, definitely still standing, but it was badly damaged. So by 1981, the city sees that so much restoration is starting to happen, and they're looking for investors. Investors are buying buildings, and it wasn't the historic preservation that we have seen in the 90s and the 2000s. It wasn't as organized as that, but there were visionaries that were buying buildings and testing out renovating these structures and seeing what they would find. And sometimes they found a lot of deterioration that they had to deal with. But this wonderful 2-story building, Monument Square building, is sitting there right at the corner. You just have to picture this at the corner of Fulton and at that interesting intersection where Monroe comes into Fulton, or Monroe Center, I should say, and Division, and then Fulton. And here sits this building, and that's what it looked like. In 1981, that is what it looked like. It was just really barely standing, is what it looks like from the photos. It was really gutted by the fire, and several entities approached buying it. There were options on it. The city was prepared to give help to these to whoever could do this project, but so no one stepped up to the plate. Finally, and it was just considered just sort of a symbol of the struggle to get downtown going again. But anyways, finally, as you know, some real visionaries with the idea of the Children's Museum bought this building, and by the 90s, we had our beautiful Grand Rapids Children's Museum, which is the photo that you saw in the beginning. So that was kind of one of those setbacks, definitely one of those setbacks. Meanwhile, a very pivotal event in that year happened, and I guess you would say it was movement of the tectonic plates. It made a huge difference. It was the rebirth of the Pentland Hotel as the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel. Here it is today. This was the Amway Corporation made this happen. It was a huge project. Just a little background information on this building. It was built in 1916, and it was considered one of the most elegant hotels really in the country. It was a top hotel. It stood on the site of the old Martin Sweet House, Martin Sweet Hotel. And today it's actually considered one, it is considered one of the historic hotels of America today. And the people that stayed there were phenomenal. Back in the day, William Jennings Bryan, James Cagney, Spencer Tracy, Boris Karloff, Presidents John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Babe Ruth. I mean, the list goes on and on. So Marvin DeWinter, once again, they were the architects in this project. So they had a real pivotal role here in the downtown rebirth. Anyways, Marvin DeWinter Associates redid the hotel. They restored it back to its original beauty. It had been built by Warren and Wetmore, who were the architects of Grand Central Station in New York City. The other thing that the Pantland had going for it is it added something. It added, well, there's the gorgeous entry, which still has, of course, Pantland Hotel inscribed on it. And here are some of the prominent people who stayed there, but I wanted to get to this slide, and I'll come back to that other slide. What they did is not only did they restore the Pantland Hotel inside and out and keeping its very classic look on the outside and on the inside with the very fine finishes on the inside, but also they built this tower, the Amway Grand Plaza Tower. This was the design of Marvin DeWinter. And they opened up with this new hotel in the connecting tower on September 15, 1981 in a black tie reception, and President Gerald R Ford was in attendance. Now here he is, this is a different time, but making a speech. Here's Gerald R Ford making a speech. And you can see the Pantland Hotel sign in the left. And I introduced this because not only was the Pantland the restoration of the Pantland a pivotal example of how Grand Rapids really got started, and it is considered one of the most important factors. But also there were some other things that happened in 1981 and related to Gerald R Ford. First, we have the Gerald R Ford Presidential Museum. And that, again, Marvin DeWinter was the architect on that project, and a guy named Jordan Shepard, whom many people have heard of. He was a very popular builder back then, very popular. He chaired the committee to build the Gerald R Ford Museum, and it had such a unique structure. I consider it very beautiful. It sits right on the Grand River, of course. This happened in 1981 as well. So here's something, though, I have to share. This is something I didn't know until I began working on my book, Grand Rapids Downtown Buildings. And this was a block that made way for the parking lot for the Ford Museum. It was historic bridge block 6. And these are attached buildings, post-Civil War buildings around circa 1874 to 1890, probably 1880, really, 1874 to 1880, and they were taken down. Now, it was a terrible shame to lose these because there had been a survey. Johnson and Roy did a 1973 survey of Grand Rapids buildings. And this was considered one of the most important blocks of buildings in the city. It was considered A quality. They had different ratings, and A quality was top quality. So it went down, and of course, you never can get that back. And these buildings were in awful shape. Don't get me wrong. I was showing this to my husband, who grew up in Grand Rapids. I did not, but he grew up in Grand Rapids, and he said, "Oh yeah, that was called Skid Row," and it was. The newspaper heading for the article from which this picture is taken was the article discussed Skid Row. So they weren't in great shape, but it is a shame to have lost them. There were many losses from 1955 until this time period, many losses, and this was one of them. Now, a nice thing that we have one of the key features of Grand Rapids, of course, is the Grand River. And we have all these iconic bridges. We have the Blue Bridge all lit up at night, and it is really pretty to drive across 196 and look at the downtown from the highway. This is a pedestrian bridge, and this bridge was the old interurban bridge. And the beauty of this bridge is it connects the Ford Museum, and of course you could then walk across the street today to the Van Andel Museum Center, Public Museum Center. But this bridge goes directly across to the area where the Gerald R Ford Museum is. And when you cross that bridge, you see this building. This is one building. This is what it looks like. On the left is what the exhibitors building looks like from the river. On the right is what it looks like from Lion. From Lion dead ends at the river, of course, and there's the little cul-de-sac. And both pictures show the ornate qualities of this building. It's just a really stunning building. And I don't know if you can really see from that photo, but what's so beautiful about it was an older building, and they restyled it in the 20s as a Renaissance revival building. Benjamin Hertel was the architect. And then in the 70s, they put that, or not 70s, when they redid the building, they modernized it inside and made it part of the Amway Grand Plaza complex. It's owned by the Amway Hotel. So I want to keep going here on this theme. So this is what you see today when you cross that pedestrian bridge. And then I want to look at this again, because this is very important. When you cross that pedestrian bridge, you see the exhibitors building, but across the street, you see the old Civic Auditorium facade. Now, why is that important? Well, here's this urban renewal map again that was published in the Grand Rapids Press. And we'll ignore the red arrow and the green lines now, but look at the yellow area again. For so many years, I know from the post-war era on to like the late 1970s, the city was trying to figure out how to make both a city county complex, which we have today in the city county administration buildings between Monroe and Ottawa, but also an auditorium area to bring convention trade. Now, we had the Civic Auditorium, beautiful, gorgeous building we're going to look at in a minute, but they wanted to build a new, bigger complex. And this is what, right where that arrow is, basically, this is what went up. This building, honestly, this is what's so interesting about this. I showed this to my husband and I said, do you even remember this building? I mean, I know it was there and I know I was inside of it, but I don't remember this building at all, really, not what it looked like. But this was the Grand Center. It was called Harry Weiss, 1981. It was over 100,000 square feet of exhibit space, auditoriums, facilities for trade shows, conventions, and concerts. One of the first concerts there in 1980 was the Grateful, that can't be right. Well, anyways, the Grateful Dead played. I've got some issues here with my dates, obviously, but the Grateful Dead played there, and Harry Weiss designed it. I have to clear that date thing up. So here's a very bad image that you can't hardly see it, but I wanted to share it because the blue area points to that kind of hulking Grand Center behind the Civic Auditorium, and the red arrow points to the Civic Auditorium, and you can distinguish that as a Civic Auditorium. You can just barely see some of the columns there. So I wasn't aware of this at that time, but the Civic Auditorium was really, really in trouble. There were people who wanted to take it down, and I can't even imagine it. It's such a beautiful thing. It actually isn't there anymore. It's just the facade is, but we'll get to that here right now. So there was a move to preserve the Civic Auditorium and not take it down. At this point, it was just incorporated into the Grand Center complex. Here it is today, just, that's kind of a morning snow shot. It's such a gorgeous building. It's both neoclassical and it's Art Deco, both things. And it's got this beautiful bas-relief sculpture that you can barely see. I think you can see my cursor over here. And at any rate, it wasn't torn down. In 1982, you saw the headlines of saving the Civic Auditorium. It wasn't torn down at that time, but what it was is it was renovated between that time and 1985. And here's an interesting fact about that. This is the gorgeous auditorium inside, or excuse me, lobby inside. Now, I don't know post-COVID what you can do, but before the pandemic, you could actually just walk in there. On a Sunday afternoon, my husband and I just went in there and we took some photos, and to the right is the entry into today's DeVos DeVos Center. And on the left would be these entrances that you see in the left picture. These are two different pictures. The left picture shows the entries, the coffered ceiling above, and the beautiful stone exterior. So now what happened was the city launched a major project to renovate the interior of this building, to put in a new auditorium floor, to put in all new systems, to restore this gorgeous lobby. And what I think is interesting about it is that the project was headed up by the only architect in the city engineer's office. Her name was Linda Haith. And what makes Linda Haith interesting is she was the first Black architect, woman architect, registered in Michigan. She was hired by the city, and she did several projects in town. We'll see another one in this presentation as well in just a few minutes. So her job was to make this all happen. She oversaw the building contractors and the design process. She did not do any designing herself that I know of, but she oversaw it. Here's one other interesting fact about this. Last night, at the annual Grand Rapids American Institute of Architects, AIA, award ceremony, Linda Haith received the Gold Award for Lifetime Achievement, which is just a wonderful thing. Linda struggled in her career because she was a Black woman. She had a lot of, she had an uphill climb to get a job, to move forward in her profession, but she did that. She not only worked in Grand Rapids for the city, she also was a consultant on the Eberhard Center project. She also worked on another building I'll show you, worked with some ramp building, the Louis Campow ramp. She went on to work for MDOT, designing buildings, and she also worked for the Detroit public school system. Anyways, moving on. So this building this facade was completed. Now, let me finish this story by saying later, we're talking about the 80s, but I should just put closure on this story. This building was torn down in the early 2000s. Before 2005, it was torn down, and just the facade and this lobby were retained and incorporated into the DeVos Center. So we did lose the building, but we kept the best. So here, you remember me talking about the Monroe Center Mall being closed. Well, in 1982, the city decided to expand the reach of the Monroe Center Mall, Pedestrian Mall. So they created this new pedestrian walkway. And let me see if my cursor, here we go. Where did it go? There it is. Okay, so what they did is here's Monroe Center. And then they created this pedestrian walk. And it was called the Promenade. It was like on the other side of what we consider the amphitheater. And this promenade is the it's the Calder Plaza Promenade. No, the Louis Campow Promenade, sorry. Louis Campow Promenade. And this is so interesting. Okay, so when I began working on my downtown building books, I really didn't, I started driving all around and walking all around. And then I hadn't really been very aware of this little section right here. So we're going to just talk one by one about these buildings very briefly. And this is the Carl Forzan Building, the Forzan Building. This we'll talk about in a minute. This is where Z's is in the Park Century Building. This is the Mirror on Monroe, the PNC Building. And this is the Comerica Bank building. We'll look at that in a minute. Anyways, they created this. They built this new walkway, and it was designed to have tree planters and lights and benches to draw shoppers to these other new and renovated buildings. And today it's where that love sculpture is, right here. Yeah, so let's just look at a few of those quickly. This is the 1981 Park Century Plaza building, and the first pioneer in that building was Z's. And I remember going to Z's very early on when it opened up as a restaurant owned by a gentleman that owned the intersection, I believe. Okay, so then another thing on this block I mentioned was the Mirror on Monroe, and that came about because Grand Rapids' big dime store block was demolished. This is a loss, this is a big loss, but in 1949, they built the Woolworths built this beautiful Art Deco building. It only lasted 30 years. In 1979, they tore it down and to make so that I think about 1979 they tore it down, and in its place came this building and a parking lot. So that's my gold star right here. So the Marriott on Monroe, although we lost that, it's a shame that we lost that Woolworths building. It was, from what I can see in the pictures, it was really gorgeous, old Art Deco building. But anyways, what is so great about this building, obviously, is that its mirrored surface. And this building won an award when it went up. It was the, I'm trying to see, let me see here a minute. It won the Michigan Society of Architects Gold Medal Award. It was designed by Robert Walden Associates, and its greatest feature, I think, for people who are downtown and are just either at the amphitheater or walking around, is that it does reflect the old buildings. Here you see the Grand Rapids National Bank building, former Grand Rapids National Bank building, now known as the McKay Tower, reflected in its surface. And in 1984, the Forzan Building was redesigned. Now, I did not know this history because, of course, as I say, I didn't grow up here, but this was really an old printing building, very old, 1890s originally on this spot. Eventually, Carl Forsland Furniture, which was located on Fulton Street, moved into this building. They bought this building and they moved their operations into the lower level. And then they had this idea that they would build condominiums. And there was, it wasn't brand new. Obviously, that was happening on the Monroe Center. We looked at the Carl Aldrich building and the Minhar building. Those already had condos, and there were a lot of other ones too in the early 80s. But they decided to do this, and it was fairly, so it was fairly groundbreaking, and they made luxury condos in this building. And in fact, it was considered such a beautiful development that it was featured on the St. Cecilia Tour of Homes, one of the units, in 1984. Here's a picture. I don't know if you can see it or not, but all of these condos had a view to the river. There were 20 units, and they were custom. The first three that were done were custom decorated by a company called Shera Galleries, by Forsland Furniture, and by Design Quest. And at that time, they went for between $120,000 and $320,000. And there was a rooftop deck and a boardwalk. Now, here's another one that happened in 1985, the Camp House Square Plaza building, which is where the love sign is. And that's Comerica Bank today. So that's 1985. Here's another thing that happened in 1985. I mentioned Linda Hay, city architect in the city engineer's office. She oversaw this restoration, Engine House number 1. This is one of the oldest and most beautiful of there are several beautiful fire stations, but this is one of them. And it is on the grave, across from Westminster Presbyterian Church, and just neighbors to the Cottage Bar, another landmark in Grand Rapids. And it was redone in 1985. They redesigned the whole way the building worked. They just a second here. I'm not gonna spend too much time on that though, because I want to move on. So before we leave the mid 80s, I want to say that right about this time, so we had renovation going. We had the Civic Auditorium renovated, this fire engine number 1, we had a new Civic Center, all the things that I've mentioned so far, but we were still seeing some losses. I want to tell you about this building because I really just rediscovered it. It is, it's quite sad, but first let me just tell you that another thing that happened was the Heartside Historic District. I talked about the city landmark status that the city started giving to some of the buildings that were considered very important. And I talked about the Heritage Hill, just basically that we had developed the Heritage Hill District in the late 1960s, a kind of a result of them tearing down City Hall. But another historic district that the city developed was the Heartside Historic District. And this is important because there were, south of Fulton on Commerce, Ionia, Sheldon, Division, so many old manufacturing, Sheldon was really a lot of auto showrooms. And of course, we had the YWCA, the All Souls Universalist Church, that beautiful Romanesque building, the Ladies Literary Club. So Sheldon is a real variety. But Commerce and Ionia were basically beautiful old brick manufacturing buildings and warehouses. And there was a move to protect this area. So they developed the Heartside Historic District, 1969, and they have kept adding to it. In fact, they're going to add to it once again. And it was really to stabilize the neighborhood through the rejuvenation of buildings. Now, let's go ahead here. Oh, and the reason it became so busy and active was the trains. The Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad lines ran right through there and provided easy access for these warehouses and businesses. So that's how that district grew up post-Civil War. So I want to show you this building because, as I say, I just discovered it, and we'll kind of wrap it up with that and just a couple of quick other ones. But the criteria for saving old buildings is, okay, 1, the building has architectural integrity. 2, it may be associated with a famous person. 3, it may be associated with an important event. And this building, while you may not find it particularly exciting or attractive, this building went down in 1984. And it should have been saved because it was associated with a man named William Alden Smith. And William Alden Smith was a senator. And not only was he just a US senator, but he headed up the committee that investigated the sinking of the Titanic. At the time, and in that building was some automobile related businesses as well. This Elgin 6 was in the showrooms of that building on the ground floor. But anyways, here's William Alden Smith. He's carrying the Titanic Report, and people just, the newspapers were, the New York Times was kind of associated with the whole steamship business somehow, or excuse me, the shipping business. And they were pretty hard on William Alden Smith. People criticized him as being so slow moving on the investigation. And so he would go over and over the same questions and questioning people, asking the same things. One of the famous questions that he asked in the investigation of the Titanic's sinking was to some of the sailors on board. He said, asked them again and again, what is in an iceberg? And one of them reportedly very sarcastically said, well, ice, for heaven's sakes. And that ran as a cartoon in the newspaper. But the point was, it wasn't just ice, it was ice, rock, and dirt, and that made quite an impact if it hit something. It wasn't just ice, it was all those things holding it together. So anyways, this building, William Alden Smith, in the end, he won the day, and there were huge improvements in shipping rules and maritime rules because of William Alden Smith's investigation, because they uncovered some crazy things, like the people on the sailors on the Titanic on the watch, they didn't have binoculars. Another thing, they weren't testing the water often enough, and when there's a quick drop in temperature in the water, that's when you find icebergs. Just some miscellaneous trivia. And here he is. There's another picture of the hearings. They held them in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Very much in the news of the day. So in my opinion, this building, while you may not think it's gorgeous, it's quite a significant Romanesque building, and it probably should have been saved, but there was a huge fire, and then the building was structurally unsound, and it, like many other, I'm going to just gloss by and come back, many other buildings that were in decay, like the old New Mertens Hotel, the Coral Knot Building, the Clark Building. These buildings were all in the mid-'80s purchased by Dwelling Place and other organizations and turned into senior housing and low-income housing. So they were put to good use before they were all renovated. But going back to this, we think this is over. We think in our age today, in which we love downtown, we love the buildings. It's a vibrant, it's an exciting place to be. We think it's all safe now. But just a few days ago, This building from the 60s went down, 1961. And I only tell you this by example that this could always happen. This, I think, was an important little mid-century building across from St. Mary's, done by an architect that I interviewed when he was 100 years old, about 5 years ago. And he's passed now, but anyways, it went down and it's gone. So just a few more things. These are, again, those buildings that were used for senior housing in the 80s. It was a very popular thing to do down south of Fulton on Commerce and Ionia. Clark Building. This one, again, also on Division, Watson Hill Building. It was used as housing. But then things started to change, and I'm going to end with last few victories. This is the Leadyard Building. In 1987, they completely renovated it, connecting the buildings to the Leadyard, the buildings of the Leadyard block. There's 7 buildings here. They connected them by, here's an old photo, by building an atrium, and then they made passageways that went between the buildings and a skylight. And I want to show you one last one, but why historic preservation? As Guy Bazzani, I'm going to quote him. He says, "I choose older buildings for my projects for several reasons. Love for the historic character, the availability of tax credits, because these types of properties are usually located in neighborhoods that are ready for revitalization. Historic preservation is an environmentally, socially, and fiscally responsible strategy for revitalizing communities." And the last one I'll show you is this one in the 80s. 1987, the Grand Rapids Savings Bank went through many renovations. But this first renovation, not the first, but one of the renovations in the 1980s was a 1987 renovation when it was called the People's Building. And it actually was part of a Symphony Designer Showcase. They restored the beautiful, I don't have time to do that, but at one point when it was the People's Building, here was one of the renovations, and I had to show you a guy in a leisure suit from the 80s. Anyways, this building was done in 1987, and I've got to wrap it up here. So that's about the end anyway. So just to say that so much happened in the 80s, and then in the 90s, things just went crazy. And of course, in the 2000s, we are lucky to have such a gorgeous downtown. The end.
Very comprehensive presentation about Grand Rapids and all of the changes in the built environment during the 1980s. And now we're going to transition to the Q&A portion. So if anyone has a question, those of you who are listening, please, you can put it in the Q&A or you can put it in the chat. We're kind of monitoring both, and we'll see how many of those questions we can get to today. We do have a couple questions already, and one, of course, is where can audience members learn more about your work on architectural history? Do you have any new topics you're working on that people should look out for?
Yes, I post quite a few virtual tours on my website, architecturegrandrapids.org. Just run it all together. And I'm just finishing this book. It should be in print in December. It's Grand Rapids Downtown Buildings. A lot of these histories are in that book. It's 180 buildings, basically, a half page on each one. So they're brief histories, but you can get an idea. Generally, you can really go into the Grand Rapids Public Library, learn how to use some of their archives and newspaper databases too, if you want to do some research on your own. We have a great local history department in Grand Rapids.
Oh, and thank you for that, because you've already covered one of my next questions about how people could find out more information about Grand Rapids if they wanted to do some research of their own or other towns and cities in West Michigan. And definitely, I think contacting the library, their local library, is a good place to start. For all kinds of projects for that.
Also, I'll mention one other thing, the Grand Rapids City Archives too. They have loads of stuff that's attached to the public museum. And you usually you can just email them, Grand Rapids City Archives. You should be able to, you could ask the library too if you can't find that link, but I think you'd find it through the city website. And you email them what you're interested in, and they'll help you get started.
Thank you, Pamela. And I think we have just 2 more questions from the audience as well. One is, do you have any background on the old courthouse that was demolished?
do you mean do they mean do you mean the Kent County Courthouse?
Let's listen about that, if that's the one you're thinking of. Yes, if you could talk about that a little bit.
Okay, well, the Kent County Courthouse went down in the mid-60s, also part of urban renewal. It was located, I showed you in that one slide where Crescent and Bond were eliminated, those two streets between Ottawa and Monroe. So it was right in that area. And it was designed by Sidney Osgood, who was one of the early architects in the city. Late 1800s, 1890s, I believe. It might have been 1880s, but I don't have the date right at my command. But late 1880s, 1890s, and it was a huge, gorgeous building. And that went down as in urban renewal. Now, of course, we have the new Kent County Courthouse where the old city hall was. I'm not sure what they're looking for in terms of information, but you can actually Google that and I think come up with some information too from like Wikipedia.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. And then thinking about the future, past our, maybe even, the lifetimes of everybody who's listening here with us today, are there particular buildings or building from our current time period since the 1990s that you would most like to see preserved 50, 100 years from now?
Now you're talking about new buildings, correct?
Yes.
Well,
or what's the first thing that's, jumps to mind?
Yeah, we do. I pointed out some of the new ones of the 80s, but if I were going to say what buildings, I think the current new buildings, I absolutely love the new Marriott Residence Inn. If you have not seen that, it's on Fulton and it's sandwiched between like the Bob and the Grand Rapids Police Department. It's a Flatiron, brand new, beautiful stone Flatiron building on this triangular lot. And that building is gorgeous. And it was designed by Yamasaki Associates. Yamasaki designed the World Trade Center when he was alive, the Twin Towers. Of course, are no longer with us, but anyways, that's one building. And I think the new Medical Mile buildings are really interesting. The Helen DeVos Children's Hospital and the bridge that goes across. I mean, there are some beautiful new buildings in Grand Rapids. Those are a couple I like a lot. And the Van Andel Institute is really interesting.
Okay. Thank you. And we have another question from our internet audience today. What do you think, or what would you recommend is the best way for somebody from the public to get started in trying to save a building from demolition?
Oh, that's an interesting question. The way you'd start, I think, and if it's in the city of Grand Rapids, I would begin with the City Historic Preservation Commission. We have an active City Historic Preservation Committee headed by Rhonda Baker, and they know everything about the buildings and they know the processes and the issues. If it's not in an historic district, it's very difficult to save anything, because there's no legislation protecting it. But you certainly can mount a citizen-led protest, or I'd say fight to save a building. You always can do that. And if you believe in a building, if you know there's a reason to keep it, as I say, it's associated with a person or an historical event, or has architectural integrity or value, then you should try.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that, Pamela. That I think is a question that a couple people are interested in from this presentation. So I think that we are going to be ending the program here. I'm sorry that we might not have been able to get to everybody's questions, but we're getting close to having elapsed the time for the presentation. So we want to honor that a little. And I would like to thank again, Pamela, for being with us today and sharing her information. Before we close, I do want to make sure that everyone knows that this presentation is being recorded and it's going to be available on our YouTube channel very soon, so you can share it with others or return to it for your own edification and interests. Once again, I'd like to thank all of you for participating today, and especially our presenter, Pamela VanderPloeg. And we're having right now a virtual round of applause for you. Thank you. I also want to let you know, everyone, that we have just one more program scheduled as a part of the Time Traveler series. The next program will be on Friday, December 3rd, and will feature Johnny J. Sam, Director of the Historic Preservation Department of the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, and Janet Brashler, an anthropologist who worked with Sam in the 1990s on returning remains of Native Americans held by Grand Valley State University to Sam's tribe and some others in West Michigan at that time. So with that, I'd like to say thanks all again for attending, and myself and my colleague, Mary Williford, here at the GVSU Coochie Office of Local History, hope to speak with you all soon about our West Michigan history. Thanks.